So, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for coming along. So this is going to be a session all about how you can use GitHub to go ahead, plan, build, deploy a podcast and a blog site. So you may or may not already know, I'm Chris Reddington. I know some faces on the call already from Twitter and various other places. But what I do in my spare time, whenever I get some of that, is I also host and produce my own podcast show, my own kind of vlogging platform, blog called Cloud with Chris. So if anyone's interested, cloudwithchris.com. I am on YouTube. I am on Twitter, as you can see on the screen there as well. I am growing. So if you'd love to support, if you like what you hear, I talk all about this kind of thing over on the platform as well. So please consider following. Please consider subscribing. Also co-organizer over Azure Thames Valley. So again, some familiar faces from that as well. And I'm also a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. So over the last few weeks, I've changed role. I used to be a fast track for Azure engineer, helping loads of different customers on board, build on Azure and get onto the platform. Now moving into the CSA role. So similar kind of thing, just a bit more relationship focused rather than project by project. And then spare time, musical theatre enthusiast, improving improviser, because I got to start just before lockdown and then lockdown happened and it killed that plan off. So improving hopefully when all of this is all done again. So that's a little bit about me. As I mentioned, Azure Thames Valley as well is something I co-organize. So whilst we're all in this virtual world, if you're looking for other kind of groups just to see what's going on and, just get a bit more talks in the diary, there's some details there for us as well, azurethamesvalley.com. Most of our stuff goes on Meetup as well. So if you're interested in any of that, let us know, because we do monthly sessions as well. So before we jump into things, I wanted to just go ahead and get just a quick poll in terms of how everyone's experience is with Azure, with GitHub, with GitHub Actions, and something called Hugo as well. Some people may know what it is, some people may not. So feel free to jump off mute, feel free to chat in the IM window, whatever's convenient for you, just to help me figure out where everyone's at so I can make sure it's relevant to as many of you as I can here. So I can see a few people there typing there. Beginner, cool. Beginner, okie doke. Good stuff. I'll let those responses keep coming in here. There we go. Ditto. Azure's good, but the rest is beginner. Azure hands-on, not known to Hugo. Okay, so we've got a bit of variety there then. So what I'll do is I'll take us through effectively what GitHub is, a bit around its history and its journey, talk a little bit about Cloud with Chris and Hugo and what that is, how I use that. And then the rest of it is all going to be hands-on, kind of showing you what I do, how things work, and even doing a real live commit, right? I'm going to be brave and do live demos here. I've got some changes I need to do to the site, so I thought what better time than to do it right here, right now. So let's be bold and ambitious and see where we end up. So as we mentioned, this talk is going to help you identify some of the key features of GitHub. So some of the different core areas that you might use on a day-to-day basis, understand some of the key pieces of GitHub Actions, help you with some existing samples as well. There are actually samples out there using GitHub Actions that you can use. So I just want to show you where those are in case you decide to start using those. And then how and why some of the decisions I've made along the way deploying Cloud with Chris and how I go about doing things there. More than happy to have questions at any point. If there's anything you're like, what on earth is Chris talking about? Feel free to just jump straight in. More than happy to go ahead and, take this in any direction, because there's a lot of directions we can go in and I want to make sure it's relevant to everyone. So like I say, if there's any questions at any point, please feel free to jump in. Don't wait until the end. All good there. Cool. So then, in terms of a history about GitHub, GitHub is not really anything new. GitHub has been around for quite some time. So it was founded back in 2008, and really the intent behind it has always been open source. It was around 2012, actually, that Microsoft really started using GitHub. Think about things like .NET Core, think about things like VS Code, for example. Those were some of the big projects that Microsoft first really started putting onto GitHub. But of course, it was around for a good few years before that. Fast forward 6 years later in 2018, that's when GitHub became part of Microsoft, or a subsidiary of Microsoft. $7.5 billion. I don't quite have that amount of money changed, but a decent amount for the company, right? And I think that just goes to show what Microsoft is trying to do with GitHub as well, right? And making sure that it remains that open source platform for everyone. And when you start looking at the next few points on this slide about GitHub opening up, for example, unlimited private repositories for free, SEML, the security code analysis tool, announcing that GitHub is acquiring an NPM, and then unlimited collaborators on these open source private repositories, it's all kind of pointing in the direction that actually GitHub and Microsoft are very serious about open source and what it can do. And that's partly one of the reasons why I used GitHub rather than something like Azure DevOps or other DevOps tooling, because Cloud with Chris, it's a community-driven thing. It's something that I want to be open, available for everyone, and that's why it's on GitHub. And just for a little bit of fun as well, on the bottom right-hand of the screen, github.com/nomangool/octocat-day. If you are on GitHub at all, you can actually see when it was that you joined GitHub as a platform. So I've realized that I'm almost 10 years old on GitHub, which was quite a fun realization this morning, actually, when I was just reading through slides again here. So go ahead, it's a bit of fun. Take a look at that if you're interested as well. So what is GitHub? We kind of talked about the history. We've focused a little bit around where it's kind of going. What is GitHub ultimately? If any of you have ever used something like Azure DevOps or Team Foundation Server or similar kind of services, think of it as a similar platform for that. You're hosting your Git repositories, so your version control systems. You've got things like GitHub Actions where you can do your automation and your CI/CD. You can go ahead and use GitHub packages, for example, to go and version and store in libraries some of your code base there as well. Manage your projects, manage your issues, all of those kind of things. So an end-to-end platform for your development efforts, your development lifecycle, these kind of things there. So we'll be focusing on these three areas: collaborative coding, as they call it on the GitHub page, automation and CI/CD, and then project management as well. We'll kind of touch on a little bit at the beginning here. But just a couple of things I wanted to focus on, because something that really strikes me, what I see happening with GitHub and where I see the direction of GitHub going. Yes, it's all about open source. Yes, it's a really great platform and great service for the open source community. But I think there's a real seriousness happening at GitHub as well from a security side of things. I mentioned earlier about this tool called SEML. And effectively, or rather the company called SEML, I should say, the tool they make is something called CodeQL, Code Query Language. And when you think about CodeQL, it's a way for you to go and query effectively security alerts and potential security vulnerabilities and things within your repositories. Think about things like Dependabot. Think about some of the things we'll see as we go along in this session, where you can get alerts about security vulnerabilities in your repository. I think there's a real seriousness around DevSecOps. And I know there's so many overloaded terms of star ops these days, but honestly, I think there's a real seriousness behind what GitHub's doing here with the security space and bringing security right into this kind of DevOps lifecycle. So again, if you're not familiar with GitHub, definitely keep that in your mind, because it's a really interesting direction that I see them going after there. So I mentioned a bit earlier this thing called Hugo as well. So you're probably wondering why we're talking about like this English butler or something called Hugo. Why are we talking about this? Hugo is actually, again, another open source project, an open source framework. It's built in the Go language, I guess, the Go framework. And what it's there to do is convert your Markdown files, convert static content that you may have into HTML, into CSS, into images, so that you get this site that you can go and deploy. So I know there's loads of options out there like .NET and Java and all these other things, which are great. But for me, this is a community website. This is something I want to keep really, really cheap. I don't want Kubernetes clusters. I don't want app service. I don't want all of these things that might cost me, a fair bit of money a month. This is something I'm doing in my spare time. It's something I want to be super easy, super simple, and super cost effective. So there's nothing more cost effective than just storage. Plain blobs in a storage account where I can go and put them and they go and live there and I don't have to worry about them. So really what I do with Cloud with Chris is I use Hugo, have all of my content in these kind of Markdown files, use Hugo to go and convert those from those Markdown files into HTML, into CSS, into these images, so I can go and deploy them onto storage accounts, and it's what you see on cloudwithchris.com. No kind of servers in the back end hosting these things. It's all just done on CDN and Azure storage accounts. That is literally all I'm using for this. Which takes us nicely onto the architecture. Super, super, super simple architecture here. What I've got, if I just do a laser pointer here, is I'm using Azure DNS zones. So I've got those mapped on the front end, cloudwithchris.com, and I've got a few records in there. I've got a preview record, I've got a staging record, I've got a naked Apex domain there, so the cloudwithchris.com. I've got a www. And I've got a podcast.cloudwithchris.com. Now, the preview.cloudwithchris.com points to one Azure CDN endpoint. CDN, Content Delivery Network. Think of it as like a distributed cache across the world, a way that I can go ahead and store those files close to the end users, wherever they may be. And where it will go to retrieve those files from is this storage account backend here, this Cloud with Chris preview. Then I've got a similar thing for my staging site. So the content that's just about ready to be shipped, like my dev environment, where I'm ready to ship it, but just want to check that everything is as I'm expecting it to be before it goes live. I've got this staging site here. I've got this cloudwithchris.com. All that does is a redirect to my www. Nothing else other than that, hence the arrow between the two there. Www takes you to the, again, the Cloud with Chris CDN profile for my main site. And then I have another one then for my podcast.cloudwithchris.com. So all of the kind of MP3 files that get served up then as well. So that's really the architecture behind it. It's just DNS zones, Azure Storage, and CDN. Super, super cheap. And we're going to go into some demos, but just to prove how cheap this is, that is my Azure bill right now for most of the month. £4. £4 to go and run the entire system that I showed you there. My preview sites, my staging sites, my main site, the podcast, and have that as a global site that is available to users in Australia, America, UK. And I can tell you I've got users all over those places because of my telemetry and my insights that I'm getting through. Super, super easy, super simple to go and set that up there. So let's go ahead and jump into some demos. So before we do move into demos, is that all making sense? Any questions on any of that at all before we move on here? Cool. If there is, just jump out any point. No question is a stupid question. I'm more than happy to go ahead and steer off course a little bit as needed. So this is cloudwithchris.com. So just to kind of prove to you here, at the top of my screen, we've got www.cloudwithchris.com. You can see my latest content that's going on here. You can see all of my episodes, my blogs and things going on. Some of it is, of course, coming from YouTube. The videos aren't getting served from my storage accounts. My bill would probably be higher if I was doing that. But that is all just coming from YouTube directly there. But when you click into any of the episodes themselves, you get this nice little player with the transcript embedded in the player there as well. We'll see that load up in a sec. And then the MP3 file comes from my CDN profile there, which is coming from storage account if it's not on the cached content delivery network there yet. So as you can see, right, as I'm navigating around the site, very, very quick in terms of loading up here. You know, I'm not having to wait for anything to load up. I'm able to very easily come along, scroll across, and in theory, all of my users across the globe should be getting that same experience, because if the files are cached in that local point of presence from the content delivery network perspective, they'll be getting a nice, very seamless, low latency experience browsing through my site here. Now, yes, there is potentially something to consider about the distance from the CDN endpoint to my storage account, but overall, a very nice, quick and seamless experience there. So that's www.cloudwithchris.com. If I navigate here, you can see I've got my staging site as well. So again, completely separate CDN profile this is coming from here now, completely separate storage account. But again, you can see the content and the feel is exactly the same, much like you'd expect if you've got a separate server for your dev environment, your prod environment, QA, etc. No different there at all. And then again, a similar idea on my preview site, but with a slight tweak. What I do on my preview site is I have this kind of folder hierarchy that I manage in JavaScript. And when I deploy the site, it's going to this preview subfolder over here. So I can go and see all of the different contents that I'm working on at once and just check before I merge it into my dev environment or my staging environment. How does that all look? Is it all looking okay? Is it all looking as I'm expecting? So I can go and check any of that content and what the site looks like at that particular point in time there. So again, I've got this flexibility of being able to see what this looks like in these different environments here. So let's jump into GitHub. And first off, I'm just going to open up a new tab here. Maybe I should come out of full screen for a sec while I try and navigate. There we go. And right. So what I want to do first off is just show you a little bit of an overview of GitHub and some of these different areas you might commonly see when you start using GitHub. So first off, you'll see that you've got this code section here. That's all talking about our repository. So in GitHub, the repository that you'll be using is a Git repository. If you've used version control in the past, you might be aware of SVN, you might be aware of TFVC and a few others. The only option that you have in GitHub is Git. Clue is in the name there, I guess. So what you can see here, for example, is this is my repository that I've got for my master branch here, so my most up-to-date content. What I am doing is I might have some other branches where I'm working on other content. I don't at the moment, but we'll see that as we go through the demo here. I'd have different areas to go and work on that content. Now, one of the other areas I wanted to just show a little bit here, not really focus on too much for this talk, but just give you a bit of insight, is also how I plan some of my podcasts, how I go and work on the content that I'm pushing out as well. So inside of GitHub, you have GitHub issues. Think of it similar to Azure boards. Think of it similar to some of the work item type of tracking that you get in Jira, for example. It's some of these similar different bits and pieces here that you might be familiar with. Very, very lightweight tracking. So I can come in here, I can go ahead, for example, see the history of what's been working on. I can go and assign milestones to that, for example, and all of my milestones are based on months there. I can go and link that to pull requests, and it gives me that end-to-end traceability if I need that. And what I can do is I can even start going ahead and filtering down based upon what I'm working on there. So I can see that my Feb 2021 content isn't quite completed yet. There's this issue, for example, that I haven't quite worked on. So I just need to push that back to March, which is completely fine. I know why that's being pushed back. So gone ahead, updated that here. And I can go ahead now and close out that February milestone because that's now all done and dusted. Now, if you're more of a visual person, because I am a visual person, I like to see kind of how things work, how they're connected, what's going on. You also have these projects view inside of GitHub as well. And project boards are a nice way of being able to drag and drop some of those issues that you have onto these boards here. So this is one of my pull requests, for example, that is open. I could go ahead and just drag and drop that over here onto this board if I like, and go and prioritize that if I want. Drag and drop them between these different columns here. But again, just using GitHub issues. You don't have to use GitHub issues. This can just be a random card, random text on my GitHub board here that I'm going and using, but I can convert that into an issue as well if I like. And now that gets the same end-to-end kind of issue tracking and everything that we saw a moment ago with milestones, assignees, and who needs to go and approve that, for example. So that's just something I wanted to show on the side, because that's how I'm kind of tracking all of my work and what I'm doing here on GitHub. Now, the first big thing I want to kind of go and show here is something called GitHub Codespaces. So you may have been familiar with something called Visual Studio Online in the past, or Visual Studio Codespaces. It's now, I guess, moving into GitHub and being called GitHub Codespaces these days. And this is a way for you to be able to go and have your VS Code environment spun up in a container inside your browser. So I don't have to worry about all the dependencies that I'm running on my local machine to go and do the work that I want to go and do. I can just go ahead, be proactive and be productive in that environment really quickly. So you'll notice in my repository, I have this .dev container thing going on here. It has a Docker file, which basically says what dependencies I need in that Docker image. So I need the Hugo runtime, I need some various bits and pieces. And then if I just go back here, there we go. Just a little bit of extra metadata as well, so that VS Code understands what kind of shell I'm going to be using, some extensions that I need to use, what ports we want to expose, that kind of thing there as well. And to go and use GitHub Codespaces, which is in like a preview state at the moment, by the way, so you need to be onboarded to go and use that. It's as simple as literally coming and clicking on this green code icon, clicking open with GitHub Codespaces, and selecting new codespace. As simple as that. Now, at the moment, it's free. I'm sure there'll be some kind of charging model behind it eventually when it's released as a generally available kind of state. But that is as simple as it is for me to spin up this environment where I can go ahead and go and start developing and being productive. Pulls in all of my code from my Git repository, pulls in all the Hugo binaries and extensions, pulls in all of my VS Code extensions because I have VS Code synced up using my GitHub account, and I can go and be productive exactly as I would be in my local environment. Now, rather than waiting for this to spin up, I've got one that I can go ahead and resume over here, a bit like Blue Peter style. So we'll just go ahead and let that spin up again here. But what you'll see is this just looks and feels exactly like Visual Studio Code. And just to prove to you, right, I am still in a web browser. I'm going to come out of full screen. There's no smoke, no magic going on here. This is VS Code running in my web browser. So I am not, running this on my local machine. This is all of my code that I am kind of working on here right now, where, all my different episodes, etc., going on. Now, once we just wait for VS Code to initialize here, you can see that I made a few changes this morning. So, there's some content that I need to go and update. For example, one of my guests said they wanted to just tweak their name and a few different things in their bio. I mentioned earlier I've changed roles, so I needed to update that on my own bio and my own profile as well. So you can see that these are the changes that are ready to be committed to my Git repository. Not running on my local machine, all in my browser, all in a container connecting up to GitHub Codespaces here. Now, the beauty of this is I also don't need to go ahead and run my CI/CD process to understand whether everything is working as expected. So if I just go ahead, cancel some of this noise a bit here. Here we go. I've got this command called Hugo serve. I'm passing in a few parameters and properties here. in Hugo, there's two main commands that you'd probably use. Hugo serve, which spins up like a dynamic runtime environment for you, just to check out your Hugo environment, or Hugo build, where it takes all of that and packages it up into like the static files we mentioned earlier, the HTML, the CSS, the images, the JavaScript, etc. So for my build process, I use Hugo build, but while I'm still kind of in that inner loop of development, still working on things, I'm going to use Hugo serve. So I'm going to go ahead and just run that here. Now, what you'll notice is I get this output at the bottom here, and it says, right, your service is now running on port 1313. If I go ahead and open this in the browser, that's my site. That's my site with, if I come into guests and take a look, for example, at the second page here, Matt Bradley. If I look on my main site, here we go. I haven't made those changes yet. So he's still Matthew Bradley over here, right? So what you're seeing is me connecting to that container that's running that Hugo serve. I don't have to have those dependencies on my machine. So think about those scenarios where maybe you're a new dev or you're an infrastructure folk or whoever you are trying to onboard and put the right dependencies on your machine, trying to get going super, super quickly. You saw how easy it was for me just to go ahead and spin up that environment because I had that container and those configuration files already in place to get that all working. So now I've kind of looked through my changes and I'm thinking, okay, let me just check here. Is my bio up to date here as well? Yes, I'm now a cloud solution architect. Awesome, good stuff. That all looks like it, I would expect it to be. I can go and commit those changes. Awesome. So this is where I would go back, go ahead like I would in VS Code normally. The one file I'm not going to commit is my config, just because I've made some changes for the environment here that I'm running in code spaces. So that all looks good. I'm going to go ahead and say tweaks to bios, for example. That's going to be my commit message. We're going to make the new branch here, and we're going to commit that to my local repository. And now we're going to push that up back to my main Git repository. So what we did there initially is committed it to the local repository on the container. And now we're going to push those changes back to my main Git repository. I'm going to caveat the word main there, that I'm not talking about the main branch or the master branch. Where I did commit it here, if you just notice in the bottom left of my screen, is this dev branch. So this is where we're now going through the process of merging that back into the main site. So if we just navigate back to GitHub here a sec. There we go, we'll leave that other code space. You can see now that dev has a recent push. As we would expect, we just made those changes. We pushed it to the dev repository. So if I jump over to GitHub Actions now, what you'll notice is my GitHub Actions are now running. So let's go and take a look and see what's going on, because GitHub Actions is the area I really want to focus on for a bit here and just explain a little bit what's going on and what's happening. So there's a convention inside of a GitHub repository. If you have this .github folder and underneath you have this workflows folder, you can put these YAML files here. And these YAML files are representative of really what my GitHub Actions are, my GitHub Action workflows. So in the Azure DevOps world, think of these like pipelines, as would in similar scenarios like in Jenkins or like in GitLab or whatever scenario you might be familiar with. Same kind of idea. We're defining our pipelines or our workflows as code. That's what we're doing in this folder. So because we deployed to the, or rather committed and pushed our code to the dev branch, that is going to trigger my staging pipeline. So let me just show you this quickly. Now, we're not going to go meticulously line by line here, helping you understand this, as fun as that would be in this hour-long session, I know. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump us back here to the presentation a sec and just show you a couple of key points here. So first off, and let me just get rid of the pointer. There's a few good things to be aware of with GitHub Actions. The first thing is you'll notice in a workflow file, we have this keyword called on. And on is effectively a trigger. And you have different types of triggers. So you might have on a push to a certain branch of your repository. You might have when a pull request is created or accepted or deleted or closed, for example. But it's not just limited to CI/CD. That is something that a lot of people overlook with GitHub Actions, and it makes it super, super powerful. So you remember how I showed you earlier the issues, the project boards, all of those things? I can have triggers on GitHub issues. I can have triggers on project boards. I can have triggers on schedules, for example. And if I just navigate back over here to this page and the GitHub docs, and I'll make sure I share some of these links with you as well, you can see just on the right-hand side the sheer number of different events that we can actually go and trigger from. So, you can do it from forks, you can do it from deployments, you can do it from pushes, or as we mentioned, issues, etc. So it's not just limited to CI/CD. It's a really, really powerful way that they're actually building GitHub Actions. And I think it's a really neat way that they're doing it, actually. So next up, then, we have this runs on keyword. And this just reflects the type of runner that we might be using. So again, if you've used Azure DevOps, you might be familiar with something like the Linux agents, the Mac OS agents, the Windows agents. Exactly the same idea here with GitHub. They are different runner types. That's how they call them in GitHub rather than agents. They call them runners. And all we're doing is we're specifying, hey, I want you to go and use the Ubuntu latest runner. That's the one hosted by GitHub, but you can also use self-hosted runners. So if you needed one on your local machine for whatever reason, you can go ahead and do that. Now, this is the really, really interesting bit for me about GitHub Actions and the way that it works. GitHub Actions, in fact, I'm going to change that back for a moment to see if anyone notices anything interesting about this convention here. Anyone notice anything about the naming convention of these users here at all? If I just navigate back maybe to, let's say, I'm going to come out of full screen here a sec because I am getting lost. Here we go. Anyone notice anything interesting on this screen and that convention? The repository naming and the user naming or the organization naming. So let me jump back to the PowerPoint because I find this a really interesting way of how they actually are planning to expand and make loads of these GitHub Actions. It's just a repository. It's just code hosted elsewhere on GitHub. So all I'm doing when I'm saying, hey, I want to go and use Actions checkout v2, is if I navigate to /actions/checkout inside of GitHub, oh, look, there's a repository there. And that is really what we're talking about. That if I go ahead, open this new browser, I need to go in private mode because of my Microsoft login and everything here. You'll notice that they've tagged certain, let's say, versions of their code base. So what's happening is whenever we have a v2, here we go. You can see v2 right here. We are using this particular version of that GitHub repository's code base for that action. So it's just going ahead, taking in that code, pulling that in, and running that on the runner for us. So if you think about that and the open source piece that we talked about earlier, communities can go ahead and now build these GitHub Actions. If there's not an action for it, you, myself, Carl, whoever wanted to, could go ahead, create a repository and go and make a GitHub action for that. And that's one of the really interesting things that I think about how GitHub Actions is approaching it. It's really community driven in terms of those actions. So there's a few first points there. On the second piece, a few other interesting points to note here. More recently, just before Christmas, the GitHub Actions team released this interesting feature called environments. So you can probably see where this is going, right? Being able to map different environments in your YAML files to some kind of environment that you deploy to. So your dev, your QA, your staging, your prod, whatever it may be. Now you have the ability to go and do that, and I'll show you why that's important in just a moment here, back on the Cloud with Chris side of things. Again, we've got those different actions here. So this is like a different stage of my workflow that is running here. This is now the publish stage rather than the build stage. So what I'm doing is I'm using the actions for downloading the artifacts from my previous stage. So, you know, the HTML files, the CSS files, the images, all of those things, that will be my website. And then I've got an Azure login task. An Azure login action, I should say. The Azure login action, as you can see, Azure/login, is an action which has been developed and made and produced by the Azure team. It's available on the Azure organization. So it's one that I can just log into Azure and my runner is then authenticated with Azure. And the one below that is the Azure CLI. So I can then go and run my Azure CLI commands inside that runner. So that's the interesting thing about this GitHub Actions piece and how you can see it coming together. One other thing just to be aware of, if you need to evaluate any kind of expressions, like runtime things, so let's say I want to get like the workspace path, for example, of my GitHub environment, or I want to go and get like a token to be using on GitHub, for example, I need to go ahead and use this kind of $curly brace syntax here. So what we're doing here is we're bringing in the credentials that I have for my environment in Azure. So let's jump back to the Azure GitHub Actions that I'm using and take a look what's going on here. Here we go. So let's go back to my repository. So if we take a look at actions here, we can see that these are kind of still running here. Things are still going on. So if I look at my tweak to bios here, I can see that whilst we've been talking, all of these steps have been running here. So I have a step to go ahead and compress the images so they're nice and lightweight for when my users go ahead and view the site. I don't want them to have to wait for ages. I want to make sure all the content is very compressed so that it's getting to the users as quickly as it can be, lowering that latency. I'm linting or static code analyzing my code base just to make sure I'm following certain coding standards, making sure all of my content is in a certain format that it's nice and easy for anyone else to go and adopt. I then go ahead and build the site. So what we do is we check out the code from GitHub. We go ahead, install the node dependencies. We set up Hugo on the runner itself. So this agent that is running somewhere. I do some token configuration and change for the different environments, the URL effectively of the end static files that will be outputted. Build the contents, and then upload those as an artifact to be consumed by my later step. And then, if we just go back to the summary, is I do deploy to AWS GCP as well. That was just more for my own benefit of learning, to be honest, more than anything. But the main one you can see there is Azure because it takes the longest. It's the one that I've got more happening in rather than the other two there. It's where I'm focusing. So we can see all that I do is it downloads the artifact from the previous step, the build step, goes ahead, logs into Azure, goes ahead and uploads my content to the storage account. So if I go and look at the logs, you can go and see all of those files are being uploaded to my backend storage account there. That's all it's doing. And then I purged my CDN. So let's get rid of the old content and let's show the latest and greatest on my staging site. So if we now go back to staging and refresh, and let's take a look at me, I might need to go into private mode here because sometimes my local browser does cache things here. Let's see. So still showing me as a senior engineer for some reason. Maybe caching is getting the better of me right now on my machine. Not quite sure what's happening there. Like I say, live demo is always a joyous thing, but probably the caching on my machine that is throwing me there. But it is deployed. It is actually in my staging environment there, so it's all pushed up there. So what I might want to go and do at this point is I might want to go ahead and push up my changes from dev into master. But before I do that, I've got a couple of pull requests I need to work on. As I mentioned earlier, it compresses some of the images for me, that build step. So you can see we're again reducing some of that file size there. That's why it's telling me. So I'm just going to go ahead, set that to pass, because that looks good to me. I'm going to merge those changes back in. And that lower image file, or lower image size, is now in my dev branch. So now that looks good. I'm just going to go ahead and say, adjust bios on main site. We're going to go and merge that from the dev branch to the master branch. There we go. And at this point, it's telling me merging is blocked because of one of my checks, but I know I made the changes. That's what that check is basically asking for, is saying, do you know what the source of origin is of that code? I do. I made them, so I'm going to override that. And I'm just going to go ahead and squash and merge those changes. So now what we're doing is pushing that up to that www.site. But let's take a look at the actions here. We can see that the master pipeline or the master workflow is triggered. So it's going to build that. But what's going to happen in a minute is it's going to pause. It's going to stop. And the reason for that is I'm using environments. I've told it that it needs to go and do that. So if we go ahead to the settings over here and take a look at environments, just in this section here, you can see that I've set up a number of these different values, if you like, a number of these different environments. So preview, production, and then staging for the different clouds that I'm using there. So I can go ahead, for example, take a look at this production.azure environment. And I can see in here, I've got that Azure credentials secret. Remember that we mentioned that a little bit earlier, and we're referencing it here. That's what we're talking about. We're pulling those Azure credentials from GitHub into the runner. So that's how it's authenticating using the Azure CLI. And we're saying that we require a reviewer. So we need to have Chris Reddington go ahead and review those changes before it goes live. So if I jump back to my actions over here, I can go review that deployment. I've already checked it over in my environment there. Obviously something strange happening with staging, but I'm going to assume that everything's working and the demo gods are just against me here. So I'm going to go ahead and push that one up here. And that is effectively my end-to-end process and how I use GitHub to go ahead and manage my podcast site. Now, there is one other thing that I started working on very recently, and that's actually how I push my MP3 files to storage as well, because I mentioned before they're also in a storage account and also using a CDN. What I'm doing there is I'm now using GitHub to host the MP3s, not storing them directly in the Git repository though. I'm using something called Git LFS, large file store, and it basically has a pointer to somewhere else, and GitHub manages where those files are stored. Because you wouldn't really want every time that a user comes along, pulls the repository, that they have to download gigabytes and gigabytes of different MP3 files, right? That's not a great experience for end users. So that's the idea behind Git LFS, but that's probably quite an advanced topic and maybe something we can explore another time if folks are interested. But again, just to really highlight here, the Azure login action that you saw in my GitHub workflow file earlier is just a repository here, which has a README file, has some examples, and has the source code hosted inside the repository. Same with the Azure CLI GitHub action as well. The same kind of idea here. Now, there is one other repository that I want to show you, and this is the github.com/azure/actions repository. And this one is effectively like a samples repository. And there are a number of different, this one isn't the samples. This one is like the landing page for all of the different actions. There is another samples repository, which I'll share the link to in the chat here. But this one is like the landing page for all the different actions you can use, which are officially from Azure. There might be people in the community who are making those tasks, but something that I've seen with different organizations is they might be a little bit weary about using those because you don't know where they've come from. You don't know what they've developed in those actions. So, if you think about things like SolarWinds, where you think about being careful about what dependencies you're taking in and, your supply chain effectively into your code base, that's where people just get a little bit cautious about what they're pulling in. So I find a lot of people are a lot happier to use the Azure kind of organization actions than one from, Chris Reddington's random repository, for example. So those are there as well. So just to kind of wrap us up here, if anyone has any questions or wants to dive into any specific areas here, two areas where I think there's some really great content out there. If this has kind of inspired you and you think, right, I want to start using GitHub and GitHub Actions and just getting up to speed and knowing what some of this is and how it works. The first one is lab.github.com. There's a load of GitHub Learning Labs. They are absolutely free. And there's some really great content out there, all about what is Git, how you can use Markdown, all the way through to creating your own GitHub Actions or creating your own workflows to deploy and build your own workloads, for example. The other one, hopefully a lot of people know about this already, is Microsoft Learn. And there is a section in Microsoft Learn all about GitHub as well, with a series of learning paths on there as well. So about managing the life cycle of your projects on GitHub, automating workflows with GitHub Actions, all of these kind of things are all covered in GitHub Actions as well. So with that, that's me done talking. That's me done with demos. Hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully that's been just an interesting bit of insight into how I manage things here. Opening up to everyone for questions and discussion here, folks.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thanks for that. It was really interesting. My question, I've got a couple of questions actually, and sure. I think Ricardo's there's probably a couple of guys thinking, a couple of folks out there wondering about this as well. So GitHub Actions, especially looking at your demo there, and as you walk through, it looks very similar to DevOps, as your DevOps pipelines in many respects. So what's the story there? Is GitHub Actions going to be taking over?
No, not at all. So I think really the story there is take the best of either scenario that you need. So there are differences between Azure DevOps. There are differences between GitHub. So if I put my kind of cloud solution architect hat on a moment and think about enterprise organizations, if I'm in an industry, for example, where I'm regulated on where I host my code and all of these kind of things, unless I use GitHub Enterprise Server, GitHub is out of the question for me, because GitHub.com is just a service that I can consume, unlike Azure DevOps, where you go and deploy, you say, hey, I want to go in North Europe, West Europe, etc. So I think the enterprise story is a lot stronger on Azure DevOps, especially when you think of things like permissions management and the granularity of control that you get. You don't quite have the same level of depth as you do with Azure DevOps for GitHub right now. I also think that GitHub Actions is still maturing. But for me, I do see it as that kind of open source equivalent, really thinking about the scenarios that I mentioned, like, anyone can go and write a GitHub action, anyone can go ahead and basically then go and use that in other repositories. So I think it's really that open source angle. And over time, maybe it will kind of transition and go that way. I don't know. But I think really right now, what I'm really hearing from both the Azure DevOps teams and GitHub is best of both. If you need the granularity of the controls and the permissions, etc., and you need to control where you're deployed, Azure DevOps for repos or whatever it may be. But if you want to go ahead and explore the latest and greatest and try some of the new things going on, maybe try GitHub Actions. So I don't think it's like a monolithic either or. I think it's going to be a case of take what you need from either or and go from there, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure that GitHub Actions will see an awful lot of development because of what you've described there with the open source community, and perhaps some of the best features will make their way into Azure DevOps.
Yeah, wouldn't be surprised. But again,
thanks.
Not too sure, but we'll see. It's interesting times for sure in that front. Exactly. Sure. Let me just catch up with the chat as well while people are thinking here. Let's see. So Azure DevOps and GitHub might be solving kind of similar problem, or parts of it overlap. Yep, exactly. If you want to expand on that at all, happy to continue on that one. Viable alternative to Azure Web Apps. Yes. So for anyone interested, there is a service called Azure Static Web Apps. And that service, the way it works is it actually uses GitHub Actions to deploy to the static web apps as well. But I think on the back end, it actually uses App Service. At the moment, again, I think it's free because it's in preview, but I'm not sure what the pricing model is going to look like of that moving forward. But Static Web Apps goes a little bit further than what I've showed you today, because mine really truly is static content, whereas I think that also allows you to host some of those environments like Node, etc., for example, where they require that runtime environment almost, and makes it a little bit easier to adopt that. So similar scenarios, whereas for now, because it's nice and cheap, I'm sticking with storage and CDN, and it works well for me. That's kind of the design choice that I made there, but absolutely another option there as well. Let's see. Consider moving from
seems like a great idea, Chris. Thanks for sharing that. I've been toying with the idea of moving my blog from GitHub Pages right now to Hugo, and then using Azure DevOps and all that fancy pipeline stuff to a web app and the Azure App Service, But this actually makes me pause and think, yeah, this might be a better idea, given that the blog is technically a static website, really. It's 3 or 4 pages.
Exactly.
Just throw it up. It might be an easier ask than stick it into the GitHub Actions and Hugo and the storage accounts that you have.
And remember, static doesn't necessarily need to mean static, that it never changes, right? There are ways you can get around it and these kind of things, but it's not like I need the identity kind of platform or anything like that on my website, or to render things dynamically on the fly. And if I did, I could probably use something like Azure Functions or something on the back end again to keep it super cheap for me, because I haven't got hundreds of thousands of transactions coming in every minute where it would cost me a load of money. Actually, right now, the scale I'm working at, it works just fine. So yeah, I think that's always a passion topic of mine, actually, is looking at the requirements and the different tools in the toolbox. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a community site, it's spare time. I don't want it costing a ton of money. So storage and CDN works perfectly well and is perfectly performant for me.
It's fantastic. I think after I get this exam out of the road next week, I might get stuck into this.
Awesome.
The next one. So I might send you a message when I get stuck.
Absolutely. Sounds good. And I'm hearing that the demo gods are now in our favor here. I'm reading in the chat. So let's go ahead, take a look here. Let's see. See, I'm convinced it's something with my local network and caching going on here. There we go, Matt Bradley in my private browser. So something strange, as I say, is going on in my caching that I should probably go and look at. But there we go. So folks, any other questions, any other thoughts? Can you see yourselves using this, or any other comments?
Yeah, definitely see ourselves using this one, I think, with certain clients. Chris, it's a good point you made about the regulatory requirements. I hadn't really considered that, but yeah. Yeah,
that one's a big one. And again, what I would really say is look kind of piece by piece, how does boards compare to something like issues and projects? How does code in Azure DevOps, or what they call repos in Azure DevOps, compared to code in GitHub, for example, and just look at either or scenario, and you'll quickly weigh up and say, actually over here I have more granularity, but I don't have that here, but it's more of a social experience over here compared with on Azure DevOps. And if you think about things like inner sourcing, how do you want to kind of weigh those up? And it then comes down to requirements. It's always one of those great discussions. So it's an interesting space, for sure.
Okay, if there's no more questions, then Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure.
It's been very informative and has given me something to go and dig into in the next week or two. I'm sure it has given food for thought to quite a few of the attendees. So as I said before, this is recorded and it will be uploaded onto the LDNA YouTube channel. So if you know anybody that wants to see this or didn't make it today or might find this useful, feel free to share it. So it'll be shared out Twitter and LinkedIn and the usual. So thank you again, Chris. April's meetup, guys and girls, is on the 8th of April, Thursday, the 8th of April at 8 p.m. We have an Azure Infrastructure as Code via Azure Bicep talk. Mike van der Haag from 350 in the Netherlands is coming to talk to us about that. So that'll be interesting. So thanks again for joining us today, and thank you again, Chris.